So I suppose it's just a good afternoon and welcome back to another one of our webinars for system builders, coach developers and practitioners within our sporting system. The delegates on the call are becoming increasingly familiar with us and with each other, so I won't labour the introduction too much and enable us to get stuck into what will be a fascinating session with Paul for sure this afternoon and on Friday. Before I bring Paul into the call, I would just like to remind us of what are now the accepted norms within these webinars, which is where possible, keep your camera on and your mic off. Direct questions and curiosities into the chat function or using the hand up button, as we're aware that the chat function isn't always available for everybody based on some compatibility with devices. And again, if neither of those functions are available to you, drop me an email as the session's going on and I can direct the question to Paul or invite you in as we're going. And as I said, unmute only when you're invited in to do so. Finally, the session, as we've mentioned, is recorded for your reflection only. It'll be shared with you after the session. Please engage with it for your own personal use, but don't share widely unless you've got express permission from ourselves. On to the session itself, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Paul McMillan into our community. Paul is the newly appointed Programme Director for the MA Physical Education Programme at Moray House at University of Edinburgh. And congratulations from us to you on that, Paul. Of course, Paul's got a rich research background in the area of pedagogy, and we are very privileged to be able to tap into that today and Friday. The reason why we brought Paul to the group is pedagogy itself is a term that finds itself finds a common place within the coaching discourse, but it's often misunderstood and misrepresented within sport coaching. So Paul will help us to develop a shared understanding of the concept and demystify it somewhat and support us to understand its coherent applications in our work. So not too small a task for you, Paul, today and Friday. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to you, Paul, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Derek. And trying to demystify, I'll say now, I will try and demystify, but in trying to do that, I might remystify. I can sometimes do that without even meaning to do it. So I'll do my best to demystify, but it's not always possible in general with pedagogy and also with myself. Thanks for that lovely introduction as well from yourself, Derek. I am a lecturer in Moray House School of Education and Sport. I'm a physical education teacher to trade, so I've worked in schools for an extended period of time. Stopped in schools in 2009 and started working in the university setting. And when I was working in schools, extracurricular sport and coaching was a big part of that job. So I have an understanding, a sort of connection to the sport coaching world. So it's great to be here as well. I also have an MSc in sport coaching and physical education, but also an HNC. And I'm glad to see a few of the names in the chat box are familiar, but there's at least two people that were on an HNC course with me about sport coaching in the distant past, which is lovely. So I will come very much from an education background. I'm not going to masquerade as a sport coach as my main frontline area of strength. My area of research will very, very broadly can be decided or discussed as interested in understanding the real complexities of teachers and teaching. And why is that important? I think that's important because we're often too quick to oversimplify and almost put aside the complexities of that task. And that's not helpful in terms of celebrating the professional capabilities and challenges for teachers. And I guess from my initial reading, that might be a similar set of situations in the coaching world. My own journey with pedagogy started when I did my PhD work, which was very much inspired by a bit of a frustration, I guess, with the literature in general, and also the way that people spoke about teachers and how things were very, very either pessimistic about what teachers could do, or very oversimplistic about what it was that it meant to be a teacher. And pedagogy was one device that I used as part of my research to try and capture and engage and present a more complex picture of what it is that teachers have to do in their everyday practice. So pedagogy was central to that, and I'll speak about how that was helpful later. I have been steeped in sport coaching literature for the past 2 to 3 months, trying to prepare for the session today. I'm not in any way trying to pretend to be an expert in sport coaching. I'll very much come from an education background, and I'll make links to sport coaching. And again, some of the discussions from yourselves might also bring wider connections to other parts of literature, because there will be some of you here today that will have read for much longer and much more deeply in a whole wider range of areas than myself. So I'm looking forward to that discussion and to making those connections. And from my reading, it's confirmed that all is well in the sport coaching literature and community. We have lots to get through today. There will be general discussions in and around pedagogy. And as those discussions unfold, as you can see here, there'll be different reflective and discussion tasks as part of that. I've got a lot of discussion tasks available. We will not get through all of them. Some of them I'll pick and choose as we go through, but I wanted to leave them up so you can very much engage and think about these more deeply in general, or a homework task as well, if you want. I'll then close the session by looking ahead to Friday's session, which will very much say, we've talked about pedagogy, now so what? What do we do with this idea that we're now more pedagogically aware? How do we harness that? And I'll certainly talk about 3 key ways that we might think about doing that on Friday. So this is my starting point, an idea that's become quite apparent throughout the literature for long enough, is that coach and more recently through the work of Julian North, who I know has and some of you might be familiar with it. I think this quotation captures some of the absolute complexity of coaching and what we have to deal with and the connections that have to be made. North tells us in 217 that sport coaching has depth, is embedded, is complex and contextual, is goal-orientated, resource-dependent, involves and engages with reasoning, reflecting, strategizing, and produces outcomes. So I think that quotation certainly captures the messy, complex nature of what it is to be a coach. And what we'll try and do with the ideas of pedagogy is connect to that, but also you'll see some similarities and crossover to this quotation that Julian North has shared with us. So hold on to that idea that coaching is complex, and pedagogy will be one particular term we're going to talk about today that can start to help us engage with that complexity. But pedagogy itself is complex. Part of it involves its evolution as a term. It has arrived in different countries at different times, and very often with different translations, interpretations, or even agendas for different sets of people. So pedagogy has been a term that's been BC, and very much at that time was about education and its biggest education has only been on mass production for the last 120, 130 years in this country anyway. So we're talking about ancient Greek times when education was something a bit different and pedagogy was a way, and the pedagogues, which trying to educate, but education, as I've said, in its biggest, broadest sense. And the idea was about character building. It was about subjectivity. It was about the socialization into the world. And again, personhood. So there's an idea that you're learning, but there's a way to be in the world. And that very much those terms, as pedagogy has been translated from Latin, speaking world into Anglophone world. So again, some of that gets lost, some of that in the translation of pedagogy and what it means.
Paul, I'm just going to jump in just for a quick second, just to say that
it's just been swept up for recent times.
Paul, I'm just going to jump in for a second just to say that your audio is breaking up. It might be better if you turn off, save your bandwidth while you're presenting.
No worries.
And then
no worries.
It'll come through cleaner.
I'm much better without video.
Yeah, face for radio. Yeah.
Apologies if that was a bit broken. I can just read you this slide if you want. Did you get enough of it?
I think we've got enough of it, yeah.
Yeah, so again, pedagogy's been around for a long time. It's been agendas and hasn't always had a long standing use in the UK. So in general, this is more talking about in the education world, but globally, the work of Thiessen in 2013 is that
Oh, we've lost you.
Yeah, my bad.
Paul, we've lost you. What might be more useful if, sorry everyone for this, just the joys of working through.
Back now, Derek?
You're back now. Are you tethering on something else, or do you want to take down the slides and I can share the slides on your behalf? Paul, are you there? Sorry, everyone, just bear with us while we try and sort this out. Paul, are you back?
Derek, at all?
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, do you want to unshare the slides and I can share them on your behalf, and that might save your bandwidth as well.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Derek, am I still here?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me? Paul, you're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that. No idea what happened there.
What I can do is I'll share the slides on your behalf and just tell me what slides to run with next, and that way it should save your bandwidth.
Brilliant. Paul, sorry about that. I've never usually had any internet issues. I think they're on my side. So apologies to everyone about that. Have you got the slides there? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Perfect.
What I'll do is just turn on the slideshow.
Do you want me to turn my camera off as well, or?
You should be able to keep it on. So in true Chris Whitty style, you just need to tell me next slide, please.
Next slide, please.
So, that should be going into slideshow now. There we go.
Brilliant. I was saying here that pedagogy, there's been a proliferation in pedagogy in global terms. It's trending, I think I said before, if you heard or managed to hear that part, which some people might think is a positive thing, that pedagogy is really starting to take off in popularity, but it's actually been a bit of a major issue. So keep the idea about there's been a big proliferation. Everyone's talking about it, certainly in academic and research literature worlds, and that's been a bit of an issue, a bit of a problem. So next slide, please, Derek. One of the main issues is that it is an ugly word. How do you even say the word? Is it pedagogy with a hard G or pedagogy with a soft G? Everyone's getting uptight about it. It's not exactly the easiest term to use in any professional context. Because of that proliferation, we're at the point now where people are starting to see pedagogy being defined less and less rigorously. We're at the point where even in academic journals, people are throwing the word around, using the term really loosely, to the point where people are starting to say that it's losing rigor. We're actually becoming really coy about starting to even go there. As Derek said, it's misunderstood in all circles, especially in education, to the point where people are using it but not actually going into detail about what it is. Another issue that gets thrown around mostly by teachers and schools, but it might happen elsewhere, it might be part of the coaching world. People think it's just a fancy word. You've got other terms that you can use. Why can't coaching just be enough? Why can't teaching just be enough? Why do we need pedagogy? Why can't we just enhance and improve the term coaching, what we mean by it, and the term teaching? I still think we need those terms. And again, I think pedagogy offers us something else and a different way to talk about a practice. Problems with it, rigorously defined, people don't know how to say it, it might not be a term that you want to pursue, but I think that the challenges are worth fighting against. And why pedagogy? It might not be a term that people are using often on the front line. So coaches might not debrief a session and start to use the term pedagogy about water sport pedagogy in terms of speaking in everyday terms and everyday life about the coaching practice. That doesn't mean to say that what they're already doing isn't pedagogically worthwhile. Quite a lot of what teachers and coaches might do is the practice is pedagogically linked up. We're just not using that term. And what pedagogy might allow us to do is start to connect to some bigger ideas about practice. I might also acknowledge that coaches and pedagogy offers is that coaching is a term that you can see people coaching. You can physically go and watch and understand and observe them. But what you might offer is saying what might be missed if you just go and watch a coach in action at a session. What we hopefully gather with pedagogy or sport pedagogy is this idea that there's some invisible, unseen things, some sense making, back to North's quotation, that there's reflecting, there's reasoning, there's ideas and knowledges and constraints that surround those decisions and that observable practice. And those things are often unseen. And again, sport pedagogy might provide a way to celebrate and recognize all the sense making that goes on to the observable part that you can go and see and watch. So it can provide a frame as well to understand, discuss, justify some of the reasons and purposes about coaches and their coaching repertoire. Thanks, Derek. You move on. That might not be enough. It usually isn't for some people. Some people might automatically say, I still don't see why we need to talk about pedagogy. So here's another bit, a second wave, if you like. Professionalism now is starting to be contested. network that we're starting to see a bit of a shift in control. Some of the voices, the visions, the autonomies of sport coach. Because sport is starting to be informed and steered by an increasingly wider range of stakeholders. So everything from coach developers, owners, managers, funders, policymakers, government. So we're getting an increasingly busy space where coaches might not necessarily have a seat at the table, and if they do, they are having to make that voice heard loudly and amongst a lot of noise, and that can be a bit of an issue. So we might be losing a bit of control about what coaching is from the people that are actually implementing it on the ground. There may be a reduction in complexity. We see this idea that coaching is long oversimplified. So is teaching. I'm not having a go at coaching here in any way. What happens is that people can oversimplify coaching and certainly teaching, but for completely different reasons. Coaches may simplify their own practice because they have to. They're in the midst of the complexity. They're in the midst of all the different constraints that are bearing down upon them. They cannot in any way completely embrace all of them. They have shortcuts. They have tacit knowledge. They've got implicit ideas, shortcuts for things that they use at their disposal. That is very skilled practice, but they might not necessarily be able to talk about it. And some of their own PhD work followed teachers for over a year and not lived in the house, but lived in the practice with them daily for over a year. And at the end presented a framework that said, here's the findings as a summary. And they recognized all of it. They went, this is my practice. I recognize it, it's familiar, but I couldn't have put all those bits together. I couldn't have talked about them, but it is it, but I'm not able to lay it out like you have there. So again, there's an idea that things are often implicit. Researchers very often, again, not intentionally, but oversimplify coaching and teaching. They have to. We haven't got the methodological tools to embrace all the complexity and share that, certainly. And the methodological restraints that they have end up having to bracket and look at key factors in a much bigger process, and celebrating that whole complexity is not always possible. Government often, or policy, they want success, they want achievement, they want attainment, and very often they're looking for golden bullet that's going to be something that will work for all athletes and all coaches in all settings, and it sometimes can lead to particular views about how to do coaching on the ground. Again, to try and control and try and predict what happens. So we have, thanks Derek, that was good timing actually. Yeah, we're starting to work well as a team here. So we've got this idea that we've got a shift in control, possibly a reduction of complexity, and we have this idea that the coach may be repositioned as some kind of factor in the whole success, very simple and formulaic understanding where coaches are held directly responsible and one of the key factors of success. They might be able to influence it to a degree, but they're not the only thing that's accountable there. There are so many different factors at play that it's impossible for them to control all of them, and impossible to control and predict exactly what's going on. So that we can see what coaches are up against on the ground. And again, that's, I think, what pedagogy can help us with as part of that. Be able to move on there. Thank you. So let's go into enough of my voice for a while, and let's just do this individually. Other tasks will get you working with other people, but let's start to just reflect about so I can come back. what are your current initial and previous thoughts or experiences with pedagogy? Some of you might be experienced, others less. So how is the term deployed in your context? If it is deployed, how do people use it? And if it's not part of your context, why do you think that's the case? So that's an individual reflective task. Feel free to just write your own notes down. Feel free to put things in the chat box if you've got some strong views.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
I would encourage people to put some reflections if they see fit into the chat box, and that can create just some broader discussion. Paul, we are still having some issues with your IET coming in and coming out. So I know I said to keep your video on before, but it might be worthwhile to keep your video off when you're presenting, if that's okay.
Sure, no worries.
Just while I'm obviously manning the slides, Stu Ferrier, my colleague from the Institute, will monitor the chat box. And Stuart, if you don't mind inviting people in just to open up some discussion as soon as there's some comments in the chat function, that would be great. Thanks, Beth. We might expand on the andragogy piece in a wee while, I'm imagining, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for that, Derek. Yeah, I'll be making the links to sport coaching shortly, which would be great. See a lot of links back and forward to education, and then people themselves bringing it across, which is great to see and hear.
Just while the chat box is getting populated, there's a question just popped into my mind around, it's kind of linked to Julian's work, where he positions coaching as perhaps three distinct things within one of his pieces of work. Coaching as a set of behaviours, coaching as cognitions, which is that sort of reflection, reasoning piece that you talk to, and also coaching as complex sociocultural practice. Do you find the same within education, that there's almost an overemphasis on pedagogy as behaviours at the pedagogical interface, and not necessarily recognising some of the broader complexities that sit around it? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I'll share. Thanks for that, Derek. It's a great question, really, really sharp. Yeah, there's an idea that it needs to be, you have to be able to evidence it and observe it and be able to, as you say, part of this pedagogy as a way to behave and a way to act. I think a bit of it's about that, but there's this broader, what I'll talk about shortly, about the bigger picture. What are the bigger picture things, and what are some of the the bigger, wider constraints that we have in your practice. So Alexander will talk about shortly, talks about the bigger picture, which is not meaning it's only the big fancy things. I think in his bigger picture, he's talking about the big and the little picture. And some of that will involve what he calls the discourses and the controversies, the politics, the theoretical ideas, the research understandings, the knowledges. So again, it's bringing all that together, synthesizing that along with your own self and your own thoughts and purposes. How do we bring all that together? And a bit of that has to be the socio-political part of this as well. And we're not removed from our societal values and expectations, I guess. What's suitable in the UK would not be suitable in other parts of the world.
I'm just wondering if you want to pick up any of the points specifically within the chat. I can't necessarily see it without going on my phone, but is there anything there that you want to speak
Yeah, there's lots and lots here. I'll just take a while. There's so many chats coming in. It's great that they're popping up and blocking the actual view. A lot of people saying that they see pedagogy a lot in education, less so in sport coaching, or they've had to make those connections themselves. Seeing it as very varied from Tom, very varied, depending on the educator. Sometimes it might involve different approaches, which we'll speak about on Friday, a bit more about a coaching repertoire and how pedagogy might demand that we've got a broader coaching repertoire to respond to any bigger picture demands that we have. Talking about holistic methods here from Stuart. Coaches should be developed within this embodied pedagogical method. If we're able to, multisensory experts, they must have the same empirical experiences. Some people saying that maybe this is connecting back, and David here in the chat, he's got a few thumbs up as well, saying that pedagogy was only something I talked about at master's level. So very much linking back to this idea that this might be a bit of academic pretentiousness here. Why is it not something that we're using on the ground? Why is it not something that we're using to understand our practice and talk about it? And again, I'll go back to saying that coaches certainly are high performing, or even just volunteer ones. They will be doing things that might be viewed as pedagogically worthwhile. So we're not going to impose a term on them and suggest you need to start doing something different. It might just help them think differently about the practice and act differently. But I think it would let them see that they're actually doing quite a lot of things that are largely positive. Yeah, people saying here, I'm not sure how this fits in with coaching. I'll try my best to make that link in a little while. That's from Fiona, and I understand that that's a concern that will be shared by many. Coaches embody pedagogy, and we cannot ignore the heat we generate in our education. So yeah, I guess coaches are trying to embody and embrace that, and hopefully, as I talk more about what pedagogy might be for different people, we might start to see more connections to practice. More people saying, thank you, Alistair, that it's only for academics at the moment. Needs to be much better consideration of coaching and in coach education if you want to understand we're in the learning business. That's a great way to finish, I think, on that. So lots of reassurance for me that I've not been talking a different language. I absolutely share your concerns about the usefulness of it, the deployment of it by people on the ground, and a tendency for it to float about in academic circles. And hopefully I've reassured you enough to persevere that we're going to look at what pedagogy is next. I'm hoping that why pedagogy part's given us enough to whet the appetite that we might need this to try and justify the messy and the professional talented nature of some of the coaches that we have out there. I think it really is needed as people start to question and try and oversimplify the act of coaching, which I think would be a real shame if that started to happen in any profession, but especially the coaching one when we're dealing with athletes of different levels and different abilities. So I think we actually absolutely need to embrace it.
I think in the interest of time then, keen to move on. So if you want me to.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for all those inputs on the chat box. There's plenty more to come, so thank you. Okay, this is the bit that might do a bit of demystifying. I've mentioned things similar to this already. I think there's a danger that if coaching and sport pedagogy are used interchangeably, almost they use them as the same thing. That's happened in education a lot. People start to just say, oh, this is what I do for my pedagogy, and they start to throw that term around. I think we need to keep them separate. They are linked, but they're not the same thing. They're not interchangeable. And Richard Tinning has got a book that's a bit older now, and it's called The Pedagogy of Human Movement. And it's very broad, and it takes a real pedagogical stance about what that might be about. And he's very strong on this idea of we need to separate these. They mean different things. So think back to your input onto the chat box there, or your notes you've been scribbling to yourself. How has the term been used? Coaching and sport pedagogy, or coaching and pedagogy. How have they been used in your context? Have they been interchangeable? Have they been meaning the same thing? Or has pedagogy been used to mean something a bit different, or even so far removed that it's just for academia? So have a think about that as we talk through here. There are absolutely fundamental differences about these, and we should, according to Richard Tinning, we should avoid conflating them. If you move on first, Derek. So what Richard Tinning is concerned about is they cannot mean the same thing, or else either pedagogy or coaching would become defunct. They're different. And I mentioned before that, and I'll mention more about it shortly, coaching is something we can see. We can go watch a coach in action in a setting, working with athletes. We can see it, we can hear it, we can comment on it, we can discuss it, observe it, film it, whatever you want to do. But what's shaped this bigger picture that Alexander talks about, what's been driving, what's been shaping that practice isn't so accessible. And this has posed a big problem for researchers too in education, where we can go and watch teachers teaching, but it's very difficult on the move when they're teaching to try and track and trace, sorry to use that expression, but to track and trace the things that are shaping and informing that. So what's the bigger picture that the coach has grappled with to make the decisions, to see the practice and shape it in a particular way? Robin Alexander, professor down at Cambridge, says that all that teaching is teaching, and what pedagogy is teaching, but there's a bigger picture attached to it, a bigger picture that's driving and informing that. So this is his idea, his very initial idea about what pedagogy is. And when I speak to undergraduate students, I'll tell you a little side story. I have a slide similar, it's got a few more pictures on it for our undergraduate students. And I usually say to them, if you get lost in any point when I'm talking today, come back to this slide 12 here. Remember slide 12, if you get lost, come back to that idea that pedagogy is the bigger picture. And then I'll go off and I'll talk for 40 minutes or 35 minutes. And every year I'll go around and on someone's A4 pad in big capital letters, all the notes that a student has taken is pedagogy, the bigger picture. That's all they've done. There's no other notes being taken. So I'm not saying you folks will do that today. But if you do get lost, come back to this slide 12. What is it that coaching pedagogy means, or sport pedagogy means? It's got something to do with my practice or the practice of coaches, and some bigger picture that's trying to inform that. What that bigger picture is up for discussion and debate, but remember that's about the bigger picture. You move on, Derek, please. So Robin Alexander and his definition, again from an educational perspective, but we can start to, as some folks in the chat have done, start to link this across to sport coaching. And I will come to sport pedagogy shortly, and people that have written and discussed that. Alexander tells us that teaching and possibly coaching is an act, an observable act, as I've said there. But this bigger picture is something to do with that act in relation to some bigger discourse. And again, theories that might underpin it, beliefs, policies, controversies that might start to inform and shape that and that practice. So it's the invisible stuff you can't easily track and see. You move on there for me, Derek. That bigger picture, going back to this idea of professionalism and trying to celebrate complexity, Robin Alexander says we absolutely need this big picture. If we do not have it, he's not saying that practice absolutely is mindless, purposeless, and random. But if you don't acknowledge that there's a bigger picture that's informed it, practice can appear to be mindless, purposeless, and random. And all of you would probably have walked along a sport venue where coaching's happening, and you might have watched what a coach is doing and judged it in some way and thought, oh, why is that person doing this, or why is this person doing that? And sometimes you can jump to conclusions about what's happening and why it's happening, how they should be doing it differently. But speak to that person and they might well have a very clear rationale, judgments that have been made, issues that have informed it, problems that they had to have encountered. So it's easy to jump to conclusions. So acknowledging that bigger picture starts to move beyond the idea that what you see is very technical and simple. There's actually something here that's informed and got a purpose and not random at all. So thanks, Derek. Leave that one on. So let's get into our next discussion. Hopefully it's as lively in the chat as the last one. And this is where you might work with a partner, if that's possible, in pairs or maybe threes, depending on the numbers. So let's think about, we might just do the first and second one. How and in what ways does the bigger picture possibly impact on your own coaching experiences if you're a coach on the front line, or the coaches that you manage or are involved with? What are the big picture issues, policies, knowledges, theories, controversies that are shaping that? And how do these inform and shape your practice? I'll just do the first two because I know we're getting pushed for time with all the interruptions with my internet line. Is that everyone back, Derek?
Derek, you're still on mute.
Team is playing up today, that's my excuse. That's everybody back into the main room now. Paul, if you wanted to have that broader conversation.
Yeah, I was actually in a room and I absolutely loved it. So thank you. I was in with Vinny and Rachel and Colleen. And what came out of that was, you know, we've got so many different things in the bigger picture and so many things to connect to. And what does it mean to have the big picture inform your practice? And Vinny suggesting that you've got to get your head around so much and you end up can be stuck in a camp, but how do you sort of shift across these different parts of the big picture? I'm not saying it's easy. And what Alexander helps us to understand, he's got a nice quotation that says, pedagogy and the big picture inform your practice, but he also suggests that your practice also helps you understand the big picture. He's not seeing this as a top-down big picture that you just engage with in an abstract way that you do as it's formally described. He's seeing that there's a sense making, a sort of theorizing of whatever those big picture things are, synthesizing, that you, by working with these in context, you'll start to have your own working use, theories and use of these and ideas and use. So it's not just a one-way traffic on that front. That was a nice conversation that we had. And an idea too that we need to, we've got a big coaching literature base now that's really well developed, and how do we start to help that percolate right down to all levels of coaching? How do we start to get ideas that we have about coaching? How can we get these to reach people, an audience? I think Rachel was talking about, and this bigger picture. How do we get these ideas out into the sort of domain, public domain of coaches? I hope that summarised it well enough. And that group that I was in, but I really enjoyed it.
Would anybody else like to offer up some reflections from their discussions, picking up on Dave from the PGA's comments in your conversation with Tommy Tell?
Hi, Derek. Yeah, no, I think those probably reflect a little bit of what Paul was talking about in terms of that invisible invisibility of, I guess, decision making, professional judgment that link into how you set up a practice, how you try to take that learner through their own personal journey. All of those sorts of things is what we discussed, really, just what pedagogy meant to us and how we felt it fitted into the sort of the coaching picture. So we had quite a good conversation about that. Bit more Andy Abrahams and Bob Muir work going on there.
Yeah, thanks, David. I agree. There's a big crossover to Abrahams, Muir, some of Julian North stuff that we're seeing this messier picture about what it is that coaches grapple with to inform the practice as part of it. So I think hopefully that's followed on from previous sessions you've had.
Alan, are you happy to come in just to share where you and Heather and Matt Costello got to?
Yeah, hi. Heather landed me right and asking me to report back, given that I was only in 2 minutes before we broke up. Yeah, we actually did cover some discussion around Bob Muir and Abrahams, who we've been doing some work with in swimming. But the key thing for us, Paul and Derek, was the why. We had a real contrast with Matt's work in West Lothian with the active schools. People coming with a different why to those kind of programs versus the sort of bigger, higher level national program stuff that I tend to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But the why is still important, and understanding that shapes what we do broadly, but it also shapes what coaches do in the practice. So yeah, we were very much around what were the objectives, what were the why for the program, but also for the people who work within it.
Thank you, Alan. That sounds. I love that contrast between the top level and the people on the ground. Next session I do on Friday, I'll talking about the why. I'll talk about vision. I know that coaching philosophy might be another term that gets used, but I think that relates right back to the why. So we've got this idea that pedagogy about the big picture that informs your practice, and what that might be different for different people. But what's your take on the bigger picture and your why, or your self driven ideas about the purposes and intentions of coaching might also help you understand and interpret what that bigger picture is all about. So I think the bigger picture might be so big that we can get lost in it. Something that we touched on when I was in a chat group as well, and how the why, or your own personal why, or your coaching philosophy, or what I'll call vision on Friday, might actually help it get a bit of coherence and a bit of direction, and give you a bit of a lens to critique some things that are in that bigger picture that are not just taken for granted by people. So I think that's a great thing to point up now and think about, and we'll hopefully pick up on that on Friday as well.
Great, thanks, Alan. Just conscious of time, Paul, if you wanted to press ahead.
Yeah, that'd be great to move on. Thanks. So we've talked about the why of pedagogy, what's the point of it. We'll start to talk about what it is, what it might be, coaching, and some bigger picture that might connect to that. But what that bigger picture might be is different for different people, and you can end up, and I've been there, reading yourself into a pedagogical black hole. I've called it that before. Where you read and read, and the more you read, the more you understand that everyone's got the real pedagogy. Everyone's convincing you that this interpretation is what pedagogy should be about. And you can get lost. And I'm hoping to bring a little bit of clarity to that and a bit of comfort to that. And that's very much born out of my own pain of trying to find the real pedagogy. And I've figured out that there isn't the real pedagogy. So I'll just share some possible ways of giving a bit of a lens to, whenever you're reading about what pedagogy is and proper detailed account of it, how you might have a bit of a lens to take pedagogy and see where it might be coming from and what the bigger picture might mean for those different sorts of definitions that you find. Just move on there, Derek, please. So I'll jog through now some definitions that are popular, mostly in education, that might translate across into sport coaching. But for some people, pedagogy is a science. And this is from Brian Simon in 1985, when pedagogy started to be getting picked up in the UK and talked about in the UK, and very much connected to this idea of achievement and attainment in education. How can we get teachers to teach in a way that will have guaranteed success? And there was an idea that pedagogy was about a science, and you'll still read definitions saying it's about the science of teaching or the science of coaching and so on. It might be helpful in some way that there may be some practices that could work and bigger picture things that might be applicable to a broad audience. But I think there's a bit more to pedagogy than that. And it's suggesting that things can be formulaic, that we're all human beings, and there's maybe something that applies to human learning that's transferable across all people. And there might be some certain practices for teaching and coaching that might work regardless of the contextual demands. So that was very much saying that there's a very much a scientific part to this. And that was Brian Simon's definition, which still holds a bit of sway, and an idea that certainly at the moment in education land and policy level, that we need to get achievement and attainment. We need to be able to predict and control outcomes. Therefore, we might have to think of a formula that will help us to achieve that. So again, pedagogy has been talked about as a science, and that links back to achievement and attainment quite a lot. Next one, Derek. Other people, going back to what Alan was saying in a second about learners, this does absolutely involve learners. I don't think we can take learners out of the equation, and I'll talk about a definition of sport pedagogy shortly that very much sees learners at the centre of it. But this is an idea by Watkins and Mortimer, again moving on a little bit chronologically from Brian Simon's work. It's now 1999, saying one conscious activity by one person designed to enhance learning in another. That was quite a popular definition for a long time, and it was very much seeing learning as at the heart of that, but also not just seeing the teacher or the coach as part of this either. It might be that pupils in school, it might be that other athletes learn from each other. It might be that some athletes learn about the activity that they're engaged in, not necessarily in a coaching session. That might happen somewhere else. So again, there's an idea that learning is more broad, and learning might be happening not necessarily in an explicit session, but it might be happening in everyday life. It might be happening from other people, it might be happening at different times. It's not just housed within the sports session that you have with your coach at a particular point in time. So it started to broaden out this idea about learning and what pedagogy is as part of that, and who's involved in that exchange. Thanks, Derek. Can you move on? You've seen this already. This is Robin Alexander's definition about acts of teaching and coaching, and discourses and controversies and policies and theories that might come to the table. And it's an idea that it's a way of showing what you know, what skills you need to command to make different decisions. Again, so similarities to what Alan was saying about Bob Muir's work, for example, and Abraham's about trying to make sense of things. Interestingly, Robin Alexander's work actually started with the work of Walter Doyle, sort of someone that was into ecology, that you can see some of these ideas in the coaching world about nonlinear pedagogies and so on, but they've been applied a bit more generally. And he started with Walter Doyle's work and built this lens by looking at practices of teachers across 5 different cultures and continents, and built this a huge idea about what pedagogy is that I've just summarised very briefly by taking chunks of his definition here, but quite a big, complex interpretation built across different cultures and continents. Thanks for that, Derek. And other people, Giroux here, for example, seeing pedagogy as being about something very particular, seeing it being about social justice, seeing it actually not being about having a balanced approach, as people what might Alexander talk about, seeing here it's about education, but giving students the knowledge, skills to make deliberate judgments, exercise control, be aware of their own existence, challenge injustices and democratic change, and making things a better world, basically. So quite an idea that pedagogy has to be about change and about making people realise their own world and the way that they might be subdued or duped as part of that existence, which is another important idea, certainly within education, that we need to help people to challenge authority and use that in the proper, correct way for the greater good. So again, there's another interpretation here, from science to things being quite flexible, to things being about learning, to now things being about change and social justice. So again, we could go on and on and on, and I'm not going to, but there's at least 4 or 5 different sort of slants that have been provided on pedagogy from at least 4 or 5 different people. If you move on for us now, Derek. So this is a way of summarising or housing some of these definitions of pedagogy. You can go on and on and on, and this was a way I managed to get to grips with pedagogy eventually, after a number of months and years in my PhD work. And it's not foolproof, but there are some fixed camp interpretations of pedagogy. So Brian Simon's idea saying it's very, very clear about what pedagogy might be about, and there's a science about how effectiveness and achievement might be possible. That again could be viewed as being part of the fixed camp. Alexander's work could well be part of this fluid camp. It's seeing different ideas, different theories, possibilities, celebrating the messiness of it. It might end up being in the fluid camp here, and certainly Giroux's work about challenging injustice might end up being in this transformative camp. It's not foolproof, and I ended up deciding that, in using Alexander's work, that there are some bits of the fluid camp in Alexander, there are some bits of the fixed camp in there as well, and there's also, could be argued that if you think about the individual, what Alan was saying about the why, there might actually be a transformative edge possible too. But I think under these 3 broad themes, and they're not rocket science, they're basically just worldviews, paradigms, if you like, about this idea of things being more positivistic, interpretivist, and critical. It sort of lends on that worldviews of different ways of seeing the world epistemologically. So it's not rocket science, but it was a way that I could start to get to grips with. Every time I read about pedagogy, there was a different view about what it was. So that might be helpful for other people who start to look a bit more about pedagogy in some way. Okay, another discussion task. Again, we might not have a chance to do all of it. We might, in 5 minutes, get the first 2. Here we've got, what are your initial thoughts about pedagogy? You've just heard about different interpretations. There are some that are fixed, some that are fluid, some that are possibly transformative. What are your initial thoughts about pedagogy, and where do you sit? Are you in this fixed camp? It's perfectly fine to be. Are you in this fluid camp? Do you see pedagogy as having a transformative responsibility? And where do your loyalties lie as part of that? Or they might be somewhere else entirely, and that is absolutely fine. But just to get your own thoughts about pedagogy, what you think about it, where you would sit as part of these 3 camps. It might be that we go on a breakout to 3 again, Derek. That would be good to get a little bit of discussion on that. Just while you're doing that, Derek, I might not finish it, but just in a really nice comment there from Alan in the chat. I've not talked about that, Alan, I've talked about it as a science. You've mentioned there pedagogy as a craft. Another thing that comes up is pedagogy as an art as well. And some of those terms can be really, really helpful. I haven't gone there with them today. I did consider it and thought, oh, just, I probably said enough about those at that point. And each of those ideas, certainly the art and craft, have been celebrated, but then also critiqued at the same time, and sometimes wrongly. The idea about pedagogy as a craft, I think, is a great way of thinking about it, that you need to, in context, craft a solution and have a way to operate. But it's been critiqued at times by saying, oh, this is just sort of all just driven by the context in your own world, and you get caught up in the sort of tyranny of your own world, and there's no bigger ideas. And also that it's a bit like an apprenticeship, you just learn as you go. which might be a bit unfair. And the other idea about an art pedagogy is past task 3. We might not get task 4 managed, but we'll get there.
Issue if we're a little bit over.
Okay. We'll just move on. I know that there's been some good chat. Do you want me to carry on? Do you want to have a bit of chat?
I think let's be respectful to folk in the rooms, and they might want to share some of their reflections, some of their conversations. Is anybody willing to volunteer first up, just where they got to in the rooms? And I'll jump at once.
I was in one of the rooms, and then Derek pulled me out, which was fine. But I think there was great conversation in there about where people were and saw themselves as part of multiple different camps, I guess, or stuck in one but can see another one now. So I don't know if someone from that group wants to say anything.
Christy, you want to come in? I think you've been egged on there by Mr. Fulton.
I don't think I've got much of a choice there. No, we interestingly were just wondering whether some of it might be related to a question of priority. So what are we prioritising within our delivery? So we kind of spoke about maybe perhaps as we move more towards a high performance end of coaching, whether we might be slightly more fixed in our pedagogical approach, because we know that certain things will produce a desired outcome. Whereas like with the transformative, in terms of maybe trying to promote maybe some kind of a social change, we might look at those outcomes with younger athletes or younger individuals. So yeah, we kind of just put a bit of a question mark over that and had a bit of a discussion. But yeah, it was really interesting actually. And we were just wondering whether we could do more if we had to choose one, or if we could be more than one, I suppose. So we didn't have to necessarily have a loyalty to a particular one, or whether we could pick and choose.
Thank you, Christy, and a familiar face too. Nice to see you. Very nice to see you.
I was laughing when you said that about what students usually write in their notes in the notebook. I was like, that was definitely me.
I could name names that it wasn't you though, but I could name names, but I won't. No, thank you. Yeah, that's a really nice area to pick up on, and I might speak about that a little bit more when we come to Friday, about how some of the suggestions about how we respond to pedagogy might actually be different based on the different levels, performance levels that people might be working in. That's a great way of thinking about high performance. You might be very focused on particular ideas about outcomes, and you know, some of these ideas in and around the scientific perspective might be where they have to go, and an idea that some areas, certainly grassroots level, might be in there about thinking about how to be as a player and a person in the world, and into this transformative fair play agenda might be a big part of that as well. And so that's a really nice point to pick up on about how the level you work at might be actually influential here, the priorities.
Paul, just before we move on, just a bit of recontracting with the group. I recognise we were due to finish at 3:30. We had some gremlins and continue to have some gremlins in the system, so I'm comfortable with you continuing to conclusion. Those feel that they need to jump off, do so, and you can catch up on the recording when we send it out. Those who wish to stay, obviously, and please do so. Matt, I think you were being chopped under the bus there, Matt, to come in from a West Lothian perspective.
Yeah, good to see you, Paul.
Good to see you too.
Yes, Costello.
How are you? Yeah, good to see you.
It's been 20 years, by the way.
20 plus, I think. But good to see you nonetheless. Yeah, we were just sort of really getting into the midst of a bit of a discussion. Alan made a great point that learning is probably not spoken about enough within the sort of sector of coaching. And the point I was making more around the grassroots level that I'm most heavily involved with is that who do these grassroots coaches go to improve their learning? And is it their committee members, those that they look up to, their national governing body, whoever it may be? And too often it's just a case of get on the next step of the coach development ladder or the next course that's coming along. And that's, I guess, where we were at. How does that, where do they take responsibility for their own learning and actually being able to shape their own, the way in which they coach, and not just the knowledge of how to, the practices and the technical and tactical side of things. So that was, we were scratching the surface in that bit of a conversation there, but that, well, accounts that might come a little bit more into your chat on Friday.
Yeah, I think that's a great shout, Matt. I was sent to someone else in a group that's very similar, that I think in terms of the bigger picture, I think that bigger picture is shifting and changing all the time, and we can certainly start to talk on Friday about how do we start to extend and challenge things in the big picture, and where does certain learning priorities come, how do you identify them? I think coach learning is massively important, and we'll talk more about some of the issues that I've looked at and read about in my sport coaching journey that I've been on for 2-3 months, trying to prepare how coaches tend to learn, how useful or not that is, and how some ways that we can start to learn on the ground from each other, in context, on real life issues and problems that coaches have, and from each other, not just going off, as you say, to the next coaching course delivered by an expert that's probably a bit removed from some of the real demands of your context you're in. So yeah, I absolutely agree. I think coach learning is important. How they learn about learners is important, and I think the bigger picture is possible to expand and be focused, and for different ideas and demands to come in and out of focus on that too. So we'll talk about coach learning at the very end on Friday, and how we might do that in a way that's relevant to the demands of the setting and the coach themselves.
Happy to move on then, Paul, if you...
No worries. So sport pedagogy, not the only person to write about sport pedagogy, but has in a few presentations and a few pieces of work spoke about sport pedagogy in a real clear way and a really accessible way. And I see some of Kathy Armour's ideas and definitions being very similar to our fluid camp interpretation. That seems to be how sport pedagogy has been picked up and talked about in the coaching literature and coaching world. She presents sport pedagogy, and that's a term that she uses and has coined, as a multi-layered phenomenon. That's dynamic interplay between coaching and coaches, ideas about athletes, learners, as Matt was saying there, and their needs and their progress, and talks about knowledge in and of context. So there is knowledge in your context that will be there in a coaching team, be there in a coaching context, and what we think and how we act on that. And also knowledge of the context, what are the demands, the expectations, the priorities, as Christy mentioned there, of that context. All these things in the sport pedagogy interpretation of Kathy Armour, again, fitting in with this idea of a fluid camp. And that's certainly one of the prominent ways that sport pedagogy has been talked about in coaching. So just a bit of a diagram of that, very much coming from, again, this ecological of fluid camp interpretation, the big picture being informed by contextual demands, things in the coach's environment, by the coach themselves. So what knowledges, awarenesses, capabilities, social emotional skills do they have that helps them perform the role of coaching in that context. The athletes, the people you have in front of you, the learners that Matt talked about, how do we have to try and meet? And I think Armour's quotation in one of her articles talks about being able to diagnose. I'm not sure I agree with the idea about diagnose. It sounds like something's wrong, but I understand what that means in terms of being able to look at a set of athletes in your care and being able to understand what they need most and what they need next. So diagnosing it, I get why they're saying that. It's to be able to sort of understand context and the needs of the people that are in your care and what you do to try and move them forward. And also about the performance, whatever performance level, Christy, that is, and how that might be placing big demands on your practice, and the tasks involved, or the intentions, or the priorities you have, how all these things are thrown in to a mixture, the coach's understanding of these at different levels, and how that might affect the relationships that you have with different athletes in the context you work in, and how your coaching practice might be a result of how you grapple with these big ideas in the big picture. And also, I mentioned before in a chat room with Vinny and Co, how your coaching practice might actually feed back up and start to change and challenge these. And I'll talk about that on Friday, and how your coaching practice might be at the mercy of ways that you're able to negotiate different boundaries, or what some people in the sport coaching world call the power brokers in your context. That's Kathy Armour's work. Happy to do this one, Derek, or we can leave this one and move to the end. Leave that one up.
Leave this one, yeah.
Yeah, leave that one as homework. That's just a chance for you to think about you as a coach developer, a coach leader, and the people that you work with, and how these are different areas of the context, the coaches, the individuals, the environment, the tasks that you have, how all these things are interrelational and can facilitate and or at the same time shut down ideas that are possible. So as a summary, and to set up next week, we've engaged with coaching as complex phenomenon and what that means, and I presented this idea about pedagogy being one way that we can start to grapple with and understand the complexities of it. It's a way of acknowledging ways that the practices that you see might be informed by something bigger. It's a complex and difficult, challenging term that's arrived at different times in different countries and got different sets of agendas and different people. That big picture I talked about and the act of teaching is also subsumed within this little picture that you work with in your context, and that might transform what we think about your practice into something that's actually what coaches are doing is actually highly informed. It's not that mindless purposeless of randomness, it's actually highly informed and actually really thoughtfully driven about what it is to be a coach and to act as a coach in a context. So on to next time. So I'll take the bigger picture next time. This might involve a few clicks, Derek. I'll talk about the big picture next time and we'll relate back to that. And we've acknowledged pedagogy is different, but something about being a bigger picture that informs your practice is one way of thinking about it. Having overviewed and set that out, I don't want to leave you thinking, well, so what? You've told us about pedagogy, why it's important, what it is, and what people are saying about it. What now? I'll talk about 3 areas. I could talk about many, many more, but we'll just keep it to 3, and I'll try and stay on time. That we'll talk about vision. So I think the bigger picture is there, and you're grappling with that. But without a vision, you can end up getting lost within it. You can get consumed by it. And I think having a vision, or what might be called a coaching philosophy, gives you a way of thinking about that and sometimes challenging things in the bigger picture, sometimes seeing what you need to do next in that bigger picture to expand it. I think if there's a bigger picture, then we might have to have a coaching repertoire, a different way to respond to different athlete needs. A one-size-fits-all way that you coach might work some of the time, but it might be potluck whether it works in different contexts with different athletes. So how do we need to be able to respond to the bigger picture and the demands there in different ways? And about negotiation, pushing back in context, how do we start to look at different boundaries that we have in our context, and the negotiation of those boundaries might not always be possible, but we can start to see which ones are movable and might enable certain practices to take place that might not have at other times. All of that's important. I think that vision we'll talk about next week, on Friday, sorry, is also saying it's important for the bigger picture, but having a vision is also important to be able to talk back and speak back to wider influences on the coaching domain.
Thanks very much, Paul. And what I'll do is I'll maybe take these key references and, where possible, share them with the group as reading between if people have the disposition to. Yeah,
that one from Kathy Armour, 210, 211 book chapter is really accessible and really well written to get your heads round some of that big messy interplay that happens as coaches are trying to grapple in context about what to do.
So I guess for me, it's a thanks to you, Paul, under challenging circumstances to get through that today. But we had a strong cohort of people remain on the call, so that's a testament, perhaps, to the level of interest in the area, and certainly the way that you're conveying it. I definitely have a lot of questions for you that I will probably take offline. But no, thanks very much for taking us through a very a fascinating but very informative sort of whistle-stop tour of.
Yeah, thank you. It was enjoyable. I love being in the breakout room, so hopefully a bit more about that on Friday. It was good to hear people in different rooms and what they were thinking about it and how it relates to their context or not, and trying to see them work that out was really great and nice to see some faces. So yeah, I'd like to do that again on Friday. So thank you. I really enjoyed it. I hope it was really worthwhile.